All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining me in part three here. We'll get through this, I promise. We're almost there. So, as you saw in that Freedom Riders video, right, there's a lot going on. A lot of Americans are participating, especially white Americans are more and more becoming a part of this. And of course, some white Americans, like the gentleman in the white collar that was very upset and visibly kind of shaking his fist, right? These agitators, these people that are trying to change things, they're coming in and upsetting his way of life, right? Leads to a lot of confrontation. A lot of these freedom riders are going to be beat up. They're going to be attacked, right, by white Southerners, especially. Sometimes the police are going to be the ones doing it, right, taking kids off these buses and using nightsticks or dogs on them, right. There's a lot happening, but a lot of Americans are kind of inspired by things like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-ins, that you can change things, that you can make a difference in your life, right. And you can kind of see it in this trailer. A lot of young Americans are getting very active now. They're looking for problems and they want to fix them. They want to take part in these things. Their movements are growing, right? Their involvement is growing in a lot of ways. And this isn't something that happens by accident, especially in the African American community. This is something that's been going on for a long time. As a matter of fact, this is a lot about grassroots connections, that these movements aren't spontaneous. They didn't just happen overnight, that this is a long process. African Americans have been challenging these laws since they were created in the 1890s. Remember, Homer Plessy in 1896, right, when he challenges these segregation laws in Louisiana, he was part of a movement. They were going to challenge these laws. He didn't do it on accident. Much like Rosa Parks, it was a planned event. And it's people like this woman on this slide, Septima Clark, are the ones that are kind of helping train people, that are getting people together. She's a school teacher. She was born in South Carolina. Her father was a slave before the Civil War. After the Civil War, her father becomes one of these sharecroppers. She's able to get an education, though, in one of those black-only schools. She becomes a teacher, and for 40 years she goes around teaching not just African American kids, but African American adults as well. Also gets involved in one of the early civil rights organizations, the NAACP, in the early 1900s after World War I. So she's one of these people that's kind of helping people kind of push against these laws, trying to fight back in a lot of ways. But by the 1950s, after things like Brown versus Board, the Montgomery bus boycott, when Little Rock is on the horizon, the state of South Carolina makes it illegal for anybody that's a public employee, including a teacher, to be a member of the civil rights organization. Once again, kind of seeing them as agitators, as people that are trying to upset things. She's kind of given a choice. You can continue to work as a teacher, but you have to give up being socially active, politically active, or you have to quit. She decides to quit, and she moves to Highland, Tennessee, to open up one of these schools, to actually take over a school called the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, in Highlander, Tennessee. And she's going to keep doing the same thing there, creating these things called citizenship schools, where they not only teach African Americans how to read so they can take on these literacy tests that allow them to vote, but also how to organize, how to kind of fight back against these laws, especially now in the 1950s when it seems like you can win. There's a lot of energy that happens here around these schools. She even brings in her niece from South Carolina, Bernice Robinson, teaches her how to do these things so she can go back to Charleston and open up one of those schools there in Charleston. Now, the important thing here is Bernice is a hairdresser. She runs her own beauty salon, so she's not tied to federal or to state funds in any way. She's kind of isolated. There's not a lot of pressure that can be put on her to not do this. Right? She has her own income source, so she can't be kind of forced out like Septima Clark was. So Bernice Robinson's going to do this. She's going to go to her aunt. She's going to learn how to organize these schools, how to get people organized themselves, how to set up these workshops on how to challenge these Jim Crow laws, and it's going to happen. It's not just going to happen just on a couple cases. It's going to happen on a lot of cases. Look at how many people are going to be trained in these schools. More than 10,000 kind of civil rights activists, if you will, are trained in these schools throughout the South. Even Martin Luther King gets involved in this. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference that was started in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycotts starts sending its members to these schools. Martin Luther King himself is going to attend this very school, the Highlander Folk School, where Septima Clark's at, and kind of learn how to organize, learn how to do these things. Rosa Parks is going to be there as well. Now, part of this is because Martin Luther King and others want to show solidarity, that they're all working together. The other side of it is some people, like Martin Luther King, feel that it's only right that a man should be running these things, that it would be more acceptable if men were kind of in charge of it, that it would run better if men were in charge. Right? So they want to kind of slowly work their way in and kind of take over a lot of these folk schools. They kind of have male leadership in a lot of these places. So you can kind of see those conformity issues of the 1950s kind of permeate even things like the civil rights movements. There's a lot of irony going on here at the same time, right? Well, some groups are fighting for their freedom. They're more than happy to kind of push other people out of the way while they do that. Right? So there's a lot going on here. Right? But this picture kind of sums up what's happening. This is in the center of the photo, the elderly woman with the gray hair and the glasses. That's Septima Clark at the desk of one of these schools, right, at their Highlander Folk School, where she's teaching African Americans how to read so that they can go out and challenge those Jim Crow laws, so they can register to vote, pass those literacy tests, right, so the whites can't keep them from being active. In the background there, in the black shirt, that's her niece, Bernice Robinson, learning, kind of implementing, kind of working alongside her aunt so that she can take all this information home and do it again herself back in South Carolina. So for the African American community, there's a lot of organization going on here. There's a lot of support, and now it seems like you can actually win. It gets a lot of energy moving. At the same time, there's a lot of energy on the other side. White Southerners also kind of start picking up steam here, pushing back harder, trying to say that this is dangerous what's happening, that these schools are kind of being infiltrated by the enemy, by bad groups, by communists, right? Again, do they really believe about the communists are at the heart of this? Probably not. But what they are trying to do is, again, taint this movement, kind of trying to say that it's not white Southerners that are a problem. It is these black activists that are trying to change things, and the whites that are working with them. They're the dangerous ones. They're the ones that are causing the problems, not white Southerners, right? Billboards across the South are going to go up showing these pictures from these schools where whites and blacks are together kind of learning how to take on civil authority, to take on local authority, state and state officials, and push back against these laws that they don't like. And they're going to point out that people like Martin Luther King are there in these ranks, that these people that they see on their TVs at night aren't just activists, they're actually being trained activists, that they're maybe somehow being controlled by the communist movement across the world, right? That they are dangers to the United States. They're not heroes, right? They're not people to be respected, they're people to be feared. Also in this picture is Rosa Parks. She's about 3 people down from Martin Luther King, sitting next to the gentleman in the white shirt. She's got her glasses on, right? So again, there's a lot happening here, right? There's a lot of push coming from both sides, but change is coming, whether people want it or not, right? There's a lot of momentum now in the 1960s to make a difference, to make things change. Probably one of the biggest events of the 1960s that really kind of brings us to a head is what happens in Birmingham, Alabama. Considered probably the most segregated, racist city in the United States. The African American community there wants their schools to be desegregated. Remember, this is 6 years, 9 years after Brown versus Board, 6 years after Little Rock, and there's still plenty of segregated schools throughout the South. Well, people, especially African Americans in Birmingham, want change to come. They want these federal laws to be implemented. They want desegregation. They start demonstrating for it. Now go watch this short video on the Birmingham, Alabama confrontation, right, where Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists get together and start saying we want these laws to change, and we want them to change now. See the reaction that comes from the white community in Birmingham, and then also kind of notice that who's going to see this, because once again, TV cameras are there, and it's not just Americans that are going to be watching this, the whole world is going to be watching this. Well, I hope you watched the video. I hope you saw some of those scenes and maybe made you think. Kind of unbelievable, right? A bunch of kids, thousands of kids, especially mostly African American, go out and say we want things like desegregated schools. We want to be able to go to school wherever we want, and they have things like fire hoses turned on them. Police come up to them with nightsticks and dogs and attack them. Now think about that, right? An 8 or a 10-year-old kid walking down the street gets a fire hose turned on them. Think about what's going to happen to them. Fire hoses are very powerful. They can knock kids down. And when a kid falls down and gets pushed over by this fire hose, they're going to smack their head on the wall or on the ground. Several people are going to be injured in these demonstrations, right? And who's there recording it the whole time? TV cameras, pointing out that it's people like Police Chief Bull Connor that are orchestrating the violence, that they're really the ones that are turning the fire hoses and turning the attack dogs loose on people. that it's not the demonstrators that are the problem. It kind of appears to be the other side. Martin Luther King, once again, arrested for simply speaking out. Remember, freedom of speech, right? That's one of our core principles in the United States. It's one of the 4 freedoms we fought for in World War II. Martin Luther King tries to utilize that, and what happens to him? He gets put in jail, right? It actually forces the new president of the United States, John Kennedy, has to speak on this issue. He doesn't really want to. He wants to kind of ignore this. Much like Eisenhower, he wants to focus on those big international issues. He's got a lot of them to deal with in his presidency. But he also has to kind of look internally, because it's not just Birmingham in 1963, but there's also other places in Mississippi in the South where African Americans are challenging segregated schools, and they want to get them integrated. And once again, white Southerners are delaying it, trying to hold it off. And John Kennedy has to address the nation, and he has to tell them, look, we have to change. And here's kind of a famous quote from this address that John Kennedy gives in 1963. He says, if a colored American cannot enjoy the full and free life all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed? Right? He's kind of saying here, look, if the rules can't just apply to some people, we can't have one way of life for part of America and another totally different way of life for another part of America. Right? If we are going to say all men are created equal, and if that's what we're fighting for across the world, if we're the good guys in this big confrontation with what we call totalitarianism, communism, right, the dangerous ones, well, we've got to be the ones that stand up for our principles. We have to be the ones that live by our principles. And what's happening more and more is TV, newspaper accounts, media are showing us that those principles aren't being applied fairly everywhere in the United States, that things do have to change. Now, I want you to watch yet another video. I know there's quite a few of these, but I want you to watch this one, because Kennedy in 1963, just a couple months after Birmingham, right, goes on, and see how he equates this, right? He's going to kind of conflate these things, these international issues that we're fighting for freedom overseas, and now we have to have freedom at home as well, right? Something that the African American community has been talking about since World War I, right? Well, now even the white president of the United States is talking about it, that these things have to happen. So please watch this and see how the Cold War is starting to affect America in a lot of different ways than what we originally intended. All right, welcome back. I hope you watched that video. It's a very important moment, right? These two things, the civil rights movement and the Cold War, the containment against communism, are now starting to come together. Kennedy says, look, we can't ask people to go and fight for freedom overseas so that other people can be free from fear, free from want, and not have those same things here in the United States. And that picks up steam in 1963. After Kennedy goes on in the summer, Martin Luther King and African Americans, activists throughout the South, decide to have a national march. Right? This movement's getting bigger than just Jim Crow in the South. Now it's about the place of African Americans in American society completely. Right? And they have that huge demonstration. More than 250,000 people are going to show up in August of 1963 to listen to African American leaders and just all types of people come forward and say how the United States needs to live up to its ideals, how it has to change, how it can't stay the same way. Right? This is where Martin Luther King has that moment on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial where he gives that famous line in his speech, I have a dream, right? The March on Washington for freedom of jobs. And King says, look, this is about the United States living up to its ideals. So there's a national discussion going on, right? The federal government's saying, hey, look, we have to live up to our ideals. A group of Americans are saying that America has to live up to its ideals. And what I want you to do now is listen to yet just one last video, right? And this time it's Martin Luther King speaking, kind of responding to the president. And listen to what he says, right? Martin Luther King has more than just I have a dream in his speech. There's another part of that speech that you may not remember from high school, from other classes, right? Where Martin Luther King says something about the United States, about what it hasn't been doing, right? And that it can't go on that way anymore. So please watch the next video on Martin Luther King, and then we'll pick it up on our last video for this lecture on part 4. All right? Thanks, guys.